Welcome everybody to another Saturday morning with the Art Clinic Online. Just for those of you who are new to the group, we interview artists from the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area every other Saturday morning. We record these meetings, so if you want to go back and deep dive into some of our previous artist talks with some of the great artists in the area from the DMV. You can visit the same page that you, or same area of the webpage that you attended from this link, and you can kind of see some of the incredible talent that we have here. This week we have a friend of mine actually from showing together in Miami with the Alita Anderson art projects. I absolutely fell in love with these more visual pieces, which I'm later told only 2% of what Steve does, but these very attractive kind of explosions of color and chroma that are kind of wedded to, I don't know, the Earth rotation even, or I guess well, Steve will talk a little bit more about them. And I didn't actually know how multifaceted Steve Wanna was until I really kind of dove into his webpage afterwards and saw that not only is he a painter, we'll call you a painter for simplicity's sake, but also sculptor, I'd say musician. You have a background in music composition from University of Maryland. There's probably nothing that Steve hasn't really touched that I can think of in the art world. So I always considered myself as an artist who does a lot in painting, but I think Steve probably is the king of the interdisciplinary artists, doing so many different things and somehow approaching everyone with an incredible, brilliant mind, where the viewer was always engaged one way or another. So I won't get into all the awards and stuff because no one really cares about that anyway, but what we do care about is Steve Wanna and his story. So welcome, Steve, to the Art Clinic Online.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a very humbling introduction. Yeah, thanks everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be here, and thanks for attending, everyone. We were just chatting before this started that it's always difficult to make a cohesive presentation when your practice is varied, but I'm going to try and do something that's sort of chronological, not exactly, just to kind of try and tell a little bit of a story. And I have a lot of slides with art on them. I may just go through them quickly. And it's going to seem varied, but hopefully it'll make some sense. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Okay, perfect. I'm not necessarily going to read this, but this is a short statement that took me forever to figure out to write, but it's essentially saying that my practice is centered around materials and how they can connect us to the world around us. And that about sums up my practice in a very quick way. It is material driven, it is process driven, and I'm always seeking to express certain concepts and ideas, which, you know, when I distill it and look back at it, there's only a few major themes in my work, but they get expressed very, very differently depending on the materials that I'm working with and the processes that I'm working with. And hopefully, as I talk more about this, it'll start to sort of come together in some sense that seems cohesive. So those are the main themes that appear in my work. Emergence is critical for me. There's some ideas when you get introduced to them that you sort of never go back or never come back from them, never recover. And those, for me, emergence was one of them. Emergence and in the context of, say, like biology or systems theory, that sort of property of emergence. Think like murmurations or schools of fish, you know, the idea of sort of self-organization and various things coming together in a way that can seem planned in a way, but actually when you break it down, there's very little happening that brings it together. So those ideas are quite important in my work. And because of that interest in emergence, I tend to work a lot with process-based rather than making things. I'm setting things in motion that sort of evolve over time and emerge on their own, sometimes completely unexpectedly in surprising ways to even myself, which I like. A lot of my work, because of my background in music, is dealing with time and memory and perception of time in different sort of modalities, slowness and fastness of time, and linear and vertical time, and all sorts of things, which I'm not going to necessarily get into, but those are things that have influenced me since I was in grad school. I'll briefly mention a couple of, given my background in music, I'll just touch very, very briefly on it, just so you understand where I'm coming from. I did a doctorate in music composition, electronic music, and then I spent afterwards a year in Paris at a studio, electronic music studio, not an art studio. I have actually zero training in visual art, so I'll just say that now as a point of admission. But during that time in Paris, it actually gave me a lot of time to think, and I ended up sort of emerging quite differently than when I started. And a lot of the realizations I made was how I want to proceed with my approach to art making. And what I realized is what attracted me most was this idea of bringing elements together in a sort of, and then under a sort of a process that acts on them, and then letting them evolve however they want. This carried through to my visual art. I stopped being interested in making things and shaping things and manipulating things directly to achieve a very specific result. I became interested in bringing elements together that somehow coalesced into whatever they wanted to coalesce to within sort of set parameters. I mean, I do have some control over some things. So very briefly, I'll just go through a couple of musical scores. They may not make sense to anybody, but just to give a sense of where I'm coming from. These are the kinds of scores I was creating, which are basically networks of activities. And what I'm interested here is giving musicians instructions on how to interact with each other and what kind of sounds they can make. So there's a lot of freedom. And much like abstract art, when musicians and audiences are confronted with this sort of thing, you get one of two responses generally, very, very broadly speaking. People are either very excited about it and like, wow, this gives me a lot of freedom to actually interact with the composition, and then the musician becomes a co-composer in a way. Or they sort of freak out and like don't know what to do with it and do something sort of not very interesting. So, but anyway, these are the beginnings of sort of my thinking about networks and about systems and about multiple sort of entities in the system interacting together to generate something that if I sat down to do it, there would be no way for me to do it. So think of it as a set of instructions for interactions and types of sounds people can make, and then different musicians, as they come together, will create something completely different and unique. There's no way to reproduce any of it. Like there's no, you can give this to one group and they can do 5 performances of it and you'll get 5 different things. So, which again became very attractive to me in profound ways, and carried through to my visual art, as you'll see in a second. This is another piece, and what's important here is the non-linearity of it. So these are not plotting out time in a specific way. They're plotting out means of interactions and ways of creating sound. There are lots of instructions written for these. I'm just showing you the score page. There's actually like several pages of instructions, so people have to really take time to learn them, much like they would any traditional score. This is another one that the piece was dealing with time and memory. So in this one, the person records themselves as they're rehearsing, and then they play with themselves in real time, and then they're sort of the past iterations of their own working through it. So those are just 3 quick examples of the beginnings of my thought processes that very much carried through to my visual work. I'm gonna go through some of these real quick. So this is where it all began. This is Artomatic 2012. I don't know if anyone here was a participant in that. It was a lot of fun. I was not calling myself an artist at the time. I was dabbling in things, and I was wanting to sort of translate some of these ideas that I had about process-based things and setting things up that unfolded over a long period of time. I wanted to translate those from the sound world, musical world, to the visual world. And this was a set of 3 installations. This is kind of foreshortened, this image. Each one of these little squares on the floor is 4 feet by 4 feet, so this is quite large. So when I found out about automatic, I was like, this is great. You know, I'll set up a thing and let it unfold over, I don't know, 3 months, 4 months, however long it was. And these were 3 installations dealing with the theme of balance and imbalance kind of thing. So the middle one was the one that became the most important, which is basically a bunch of water balloons hanging, and they were dipped in plaster. And as the time passed during automatic, if you've ever filled up a balloon and let it sit, it just slowly loses air over time. And as the balloons shrunk and shrunk and shrunk, as they're just naturally losing air, they pulled away from the plaster, and the plaster fell. So over time, you know, you'd get one thing and multiple things, and eventually the whole thing was covered in plaster. So that was the beginning of sort of my love of what is now called spatiotemporal installations. So they're installations that take up time and take up space and require time to unfold. So each time you encounter it, if you were to go on day 1 versus day 10, you're experiencing something completely different. It's just constantly unfolding in real time. And your encounter with it is just a passing moment in a sense. This is not entirely chronological, but mostly chronological. So these are sort of things that carried me through. So this idea of dropping things like this led not quite directly, but almost directly to the Myths of Creation series, the one that Jordan was talking about. And these evolved over a number of years. So what you're going to see is sort of the final result of many years of work. A lot of times when I'm starting out new things, I end up having to do a lot of learning, partly because I don't have training, but partly because I'm combining materials in sort of unorthodox ways. And I need to learn about things. I need to experiment a lot, and I need to test a lot. And there's a lot of failed experiments in this particular series that led me to where I am now. And this series, the origins of it were, if you've ever seen images of Hubble telescope, of like a supernova, exploding stars, that sort of thing. I'm just a science geek, and I always loved looking at these images. Now there's the Webb telescope as well. And I think at one point I was just, you know, looking at very, very beautiful and sort of stunning images, and I was reading the captions, and it said, you know, such and such supernova was, I don't know, 500 million light years away. And I stopped and thought about it for a second. I don't know if you know this, but if, you know, a light year is the amount of time it takes light to travel. So 500 million light years away is 500 million years ago. So you're looking at an event that occurred, you know, 500 million years ago or 100 million years ago, whatever it is. It's done, it's occurred, and you're capturing, we threw up this instrument in the sky and somehow magically captured this thing that's light has been traveling in the universe this whole time. And it looks like it just happened. And I was just completely was floored with that idea of being able to capture something, create something that looks like it's a frozen action that whenever you look at it, it looks like it just happened. And if you look away, it'll continue to happen, that sort of thing. And so I came up with this series, which is basically a process in a sense, and there's a lot of indeterminacy in it, much like my musical scores. So what you're looking at is a single event frozen in time. And basically I make these boards that I prepare, and then I explode these things on them that are placed in shells that I make. And then everything you see on the surface is contained in the shell, much like an exploding star. So it looks like they have a lot of dynamism to them. They look like they're in motion. They look like if you looked away, they might continue to, you know, the explosion might continue to go on. It took me forever to find this. So the idea for them was inspired by the falling plaster, or maybe it was the other way around. Maybe the plaster balloons were inspired by this. I can't remember at this point. But it took me forever to come up with a way of fixing them, because what I like to use a lot, one of my favorite materials is powdered pigments. and this has a lot of powdered pigments, and that's what creates a lot of the excitement and sort of the textures and the topography of this. They have a depth to them. Usually they're about 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, depending on the amount of material in there. And it took me forever to figure out a way of actually fixing them and eventually casting them in resin. So they have a 3-dimensionality to them. What's important here is that I don't actually ever touch the surface directly. So I drop these from a height and they explode, and I usually just leave them alone and then just proceed to fix them. So that's me sort of getting out of the way of my own art making in a way. I don't want to get in there and make, you know, brush strokes and dabble and make specific things. I just want the thing to emerge on its own, in a sense, with me sort of setting up something. So I'm just going to go through a few quickly, and you know, they're kind of pretty to look at. But,
Steve, I know the titles for these are complex. Can you talk a little bit about how you label these?
yeah, thanks. Yeah, so they're all called myths of creation, and then there's a dash, and then a CE, which is if you ever looked at sort of how NASA names supernovae, they give them these geeky names. So I kind of wanted to do something kind of like that, not really. But what they are basically is a string of numbers which amounts to the exact date and time of the explosion itself. So I actually video record these and then go back and find the timestamp of the instant of the explosion. So it'll say something like, you know, the day, month, year, and then the time in minutes and seconds of each explosion. I hate titles. I think everybody does, maybe. It's really difficult to come up with titles. So this was my way of just giving them a title that made sense in the context of them, but also easy. All I have to do is just make sure I record it and go back and give it the title. So it ends up being pretty easy. And each, you know, they tend to have this sort of starburst look to them. Not always. The smaller ones sometimes look different. But they're all sort of unique, truly unique, in the sense that there's no way I can repeat this. In fact, I did a series, I don't think I have it here, intentionally demonstrating this to myself more than anyone else. And I did a series of 4 pieces, small, like 10-inch discs, and I did the exact same color combinations in all 4 of them, and they look nothing like. So anyway, these are just a bunch of them. I'll just go through them real quick. And they look pretty fun and exciting in real life, more so than in photos. The trick to photographing these, I learned, is to photograph them before I cast them in resin, which is the only way to do it without creating a ton of shine. But it also loses the depth a little bit, so it's kind of a trade-off. This is a rectangular one. The rectangular ones were the ones I was making initially, and then I switched over to making discs.
And these are like maybe 2 or 3 inches thick, right? With like the
yeah,
frame.
2.5 inches with the frame. So they're quite thick, and the resin layer, depending on the aggregates in there, like whatever the materials are, can be anywhere from 1/2 inch to like 1 inch of resin. So they vary. Yeah, so that's it. And this idea of like, you know, creating processes that could yield objects like that led me to experiment also with cast wax. The one behind me is a cast wax piece. And these were, again, using materials in ways that are sort of unconventional necessarily, or unexpected. So everybody uses wax for various, you know, sculpting applications. And I was using it to actually make pieces rather than as a means to make a piece. And so I started casting these wax pieces. And this is something I actually played with as a kid. I grew up in the country during the war. And a lot of times we didn't have electricity. So I would grow up on candlelight, essentially. And I would just sit there and play with candles and melting wax into water and that sort of thing. And so I started experimenting with it. So these are essentially made upside down, cast in water. And there again, I have some control over the method a little bit, but not really, because I can't see what I'm doing, quite literally. So the result is what it is. It's a part of a process, and whatever emerges in a sense. And this is the one behind me. Is supposed to be lit up, but it's unplugged right now. That's what it looks like. So any questions at this point? I know this is a lot to take in, sort of.
And one quick question, just and maybe you'll kind of touch on this more as things go on, but can you talk a little bit about how you think your training or their lack of has influenced how you approach making art? Do you think if you had, an absurd amount of visual art training, would improve this is completely, fabricated, but if you feel like would you feel if you had all this training, your process would be better or just different?
Yeah, I mean, I think different. I don't know if it'd be better or worse. There are advantages and disadvantages to accumulating knowledge. The advantage, obviously, is you know a lot, and you don't have to start from scratch each time. The disadvantage is that you know a lot, and you can assume a lot of things, and you tend to get locked into certain ways of thinking about materials that you're very familiar with. And my process, part of it is always throwing myself against materials that are new to me, partly because I want to go through that process of like, I don't know anything about this, and I have no idea what it's going to do. And there's a lot of potential there for experimentation and sort of discovery. And I think that's where I find I'm most happy in that sort of zone of discomfort and discovery. And I think the more you know, the harder it is to sort of like, I mean, you could do it. You can sort of like mentally, okay, I'm going to let go of all my preconceived notions about this material that I spent many years with. It's really actually hard to do in real life to actually affect that. As they say in Zen, Zen mind, beginner's mind, it's that cultivating that quality of like not knowing in order to be able to look at something in a completely new way, completely fresh eyes. And that's part of sort of the high that I pursue in a weird way, is like throwing myself against completely new materials and seeing what do they offer and how can I manipulate them. And it also allows me the flexibility to be unorthodox, because I don't know what it's supposed to do. I don't know that you're not supposed to mix oils and waters or whatever it might be. I'm just making stuff up now. And what does happen when I mix them? Who knows? Maybe something completely uninteresting, maybe something completely spectacular. And there's a lot of sort of discovery in that. Yeah. That's actually a good question to ask, because my biggest sticking point has to do more with the thing that I know most, which is sound. I tend to look at it in very specific ways, and it's much harder for me to divorce that in my brain. So what I'm going to talk about next is sound sculptures. And it was really tricky for me to go from being a composer of writing sort of pieces to actually making sound sculptures, because the biggest sticking point for me was like, what sounds are they making? I don't want just arbitrary sounds. They're not little speakers playing music, I wanted the thing to be fully integrated, and it took me forever to come up with anything that was satisfactory to me. And I still sometimes, consider it not that satisfactory. So it's in some ways a lot easier for me to go into a completely unknown realm to me, like visual media and powder pigments. I don't know what you're supposed to do with powder pigments. If you're taught certain things, I don't know, I'm putting them in plaster shells and throwing them on the floor. That's probably not a thing you're supposed to do, but it gives me freedom in a way. Yeah, thanks. Great question. So I'm not going to spend too much time on these sound sculptures. I'm just going to quickly touch on them, but they're essentially the initial forays into presenting sound in a visual way, or in combination with visuals. So this is one of the first set of sculptures I made that are considered sound sculptures. This was my first solo show, actually, in 2014, 10 years ago. And what this is a set of 5 pieces that act almost like a set of 5 organisms that are not necessarily communicating with each other, but just coexisting in a space. And each of them is more or less self-contained. They're all driven by microprocessors, each separate microprocessor, but they're running a similar software. So they're sort of behaving in a limited set of parameters, but they're all independent from each other. And what's beautiful about something like this is that process, which is in some ways utterly random, well, random within limits, comes in contact with the human brain. The human brain is just masterful at figuring out patterns or inventing patterns, sometimes seeing patterns where there aren't any. or meaning where there isn't any. You can stand in front of this piece and suddenly it can start to seem like it's coordinating and start to seem to have meaning to the motions of it. But what each of them is doing, basically, it's very simple. It functions with light and sound. So there's a software that controls the light and the sound simultaneously, and they're all moving basically like a swelling. So it goes, it ramps up and ramps down in a certain number of seconds. So it ramps up the sound and the light, ramps down the sound of them. And they're doing it, and there's variations, you know, so it's like within roughly 10 seconds, 10 to 15 seconds, let's say, with some silence between them. So they all have the same code, but they're tolerances of limits and randomness. And you can stand in front of this thing and it just can seem like only one of them is moving, only two of them are moving, all five are moving simultaneously. And occasionally, on very rare occasions, the possibility does exist that they can all, at the same time, swell up and swell down together like they are coordinated. The odds of that happening, I think the way I built the software was not zero, but, you know, vanishingly small. So if you stood there for 1,000 years, you might experience it, I suppose. Who knows? And these were, I struggled a lot with the material that they should be presented in, and ended up actually commissioning a ceramic artist to make me, I designed this thing and he made it out of slip cast porcelain, basically. So they're 5 porcelain cubes with they're hollow inside, they're slip cast, so I can put the electronics in there, the lights and the sound and the little microprocessor and speaker and stuff like that. And they're about like, I don't know, 5 by 5 or something like that, 5.5 by 5.5 something. There's a close-up of that that's very blurry. Okay. Yeah. And they're about, I think, 2 inches thick. And this sort of got me going on this idea of enclosed spaces or hidden spaces and sounds that they can make. And I started making these things that were little chambers that had sound in them. And again, I was always with these, I was always struggling with the sound and wanting the sound to be not arbitrary, not music, not something I composed. I wanted it to be somehow congruent with the piece itself, with the idea itself. It's very important to me, which is why I struggle to make sound sculptures more than anything else, which is bizarre. But this is a thing like, I don't know, 3 inches by 3 inches or 3.5 by 3.5. And it has a little speaker in it. And the speaker is set to make white noise, basically static sound at very, very loud level. And when the door is closed, you sort of hear this kind of very, very subtle whooshing sound. But if you open the door, it's like in your face, kind of very loud noise. So again, I'm exploring here the notion of hidden spaces, which becomes important later on in other sound sculptures. This one was a similar thing. Again, sound contained inside a little vessel. These are little mason jars, and they have these little radios in them. So the mason jars, I don't know, 4 inches long. These all have sounds, by the way. I refrained from putting videos in here because, you know, it's always issues with videos in PowerPoint. But I have some samples on my website if you want to go listen to them. And this was using basically, if you've ever handled a mason jar and you have the lid for the canning, you know, the one that separates from the rim or whatever, I don't know what the names are. It actually has a nice resonant frequency to it, almost like a drum head. And so what I was doing here was I was using the radios, those little speaker radios, and their antennas are touching the top of the mason jar. And when the lid is closed tightly on it, that creates a resonance inside. And what I tuned these radios to, I think, was like FM radio or AM radio or something, so like talk radio, basically. So you can't really hear what the person is saying, but you get the rhythm of the speech. And it sounds very filtered and very sort of hypnotic in a way. So it has the semblance of speech, but nothing like audible or perceptible. And this was in conjunction with other things that I can't show here that I was doing at the time, which were sound installations that were sort of taking poetry and recording it and mixing it in weird ways on like 6-8 channels, that sort of thing. There's no visual for that. It's just a set of speakers in a space that I was presenting at, you know, universities and conferences and things like that at the time. So again, taking those ideas that were purely sonic and trying to sort of somehow marry them into the visual world, sculptural world. This is me playing with wax and then trying to add some light and sound to it. So these are 5, I don't know what you'd call them, little cells, I guess. And this one, the one before it, the ceramic one, and other things that I was doing in sound alone. At the time, I was really influenced by a branch of mathematics called cellular automata, which is essentially a way of creating mathematical rules to create self-organization organisms or to mimic self-organization organisms. And I was using those sort of mathematical formulas in software I was writing to create these sorts of things. So this is the same thing of taking these 5 organisms, giving them autonomy within a certain set of parameters, and then launching it and letting it go. And again, if you experience it for some period of time, you start to hear some sort of patterns emerging in the sound that they were playing. This is another example of a sound sculpture. These are 2 side-by-side images of sound inside a concealed chamber. So this idea of sound inside spaces later on becomes pretty big in a series I created for a museum show 2 years ago now. I became fascinated with the idea of sound. The fascinating thing about sound, unlike light, is that it's omnidirectional and it can bend around surfaces. So if I were to put an image inside this chamber, you couldn't see it. But if I put sound inside it, you can actually hear it on the outside. So it's the idea of like playing with this medium where you can't see the source, but you can hear the thing. And also using the sculpture itself as a way of filtering the sound. And so inside this is a little speaker playing a little thing I created for it, a little piece of music I created for it. And it's acting as if it's, so it's intentionally designed to sound like it's coming from a giant cathedral. And so when you hear it, it actually does sound like it's this very echoey, large chamber, but the thing is like, I don't know, 12 inches tall. So it's deceptively large, or it sounds large, but it's actually small source, which is a really cool thing you can do with sound. I won't get into it too much, but you can fool the brain really well with, we all experience it when we go to movies and things like that. You can fool the brain pretty effectively with certain things with sound. Create space where there isn't, that sort of thing. Anytime you put headphones on, that's what's happening actually. So anyway, so the next thing I will talk about is the sound sculptures that sort of emerged many years later out of these experimentations and some spatiotemporal installations. This was one of the first sort of profound experience for me to create this, because I designed it for a long time and wanted to create it and didn't have a place to do it, and finally got in on this conference in Virginia Tech. I think was the first one I presented at, and they gave me free reign. They gave me a black box theater and said you could use the space. I was like, awesome. So let's see if I can show you some other photos of it. It's basically a 7-channel sound installation with light and water. And what you're looking at there is a table with 7 little bowls of water, and the thing on top is an apparatus I built that drips water very slowly and randomly on these bowls. And there are microphones picking up the sound. So what you're hearing there is this, it's a very hypnotic sound. It sounds very sort of cave-like. But the experiences of this sort of contemplative or meditative experience of sitting in a space, darkened space, and you're engulfed in sound of water dripping, but also some other electronic sounds happening that are driven by a computer software program that I wrote, which was responding to the dripping water and being triggered by the dripping water. And you hear a dripping water, so you're hearing the actual sounds of the water drops, and then you're hearing sort of processing of them in real time. And there's no linearity to it. There's no purpose to it. You just sit there basically and sort of clear your mind, and it's quite nice. It's kind of an immersive, very immersive experience. And this was the first time I did this was in 2015, and I got to do it, I think, 1 or 2 more times. So this type of immersive installation is really what I love doing the most. It's much harder to do because you have to be given a black box theater like this and given free reign. But this is what I love to do, and I got to do it most recently in another installation I'll show in a little bit. This is another installation I did at DC/AC, site-specific, also sound and light, and in this case, fabric. And this has to do with sort of another obsession of mine, which is sort of delineating limits of things and boundaries. So I won't get too much into it, but happy to answer questions about it. This was my second solo show in 2019, and I got to do a theme show on time, passage of time, and different ways of perceiving time. And the pieces you see on the right hand of the screen are the ones from Myths of Creation series. So those are dealing with one aspect of time, like a frozen moment. The ones on the left and around the corner in the back, which I'll show in a second, are installations. This was my first time actually getting to present this idea. I'd been sort of tinkering with it for a while, but this was sort of first time I got to really present it in a way that was meaningful to me. And it's the idea of using dripping water to very slowly change something. And in this case, what you're looking at, I'll come back to those in a second. What you're looking at in those are basically little molded cubes of pigment. That's what they are. And they're set underneath these spheres of dripping water, and the water is dripping really slowly. And it can seem like nothing is happening initially, but the show was up, I think, for maybe a month or so, maybe a little less. And it'd be better if it was longer, but you're seeing very, very slow change over a long period of time. At the end of the exhibition, towards the very end of the exhibition, so I had a cube, a sphere, and a pyramid. The sphere finally gave way and crumbled, as you can see. Unfortunately, no one was there to see it, which is kind of disappointing, but that's life. So this idea of using water in a very slow process, sort of very self-contained process. And if you're standing there, when I would stand in front of these, it's kind of mesmerizing to watch the water drip. It's like watching paint dry. But then you go away for a couple of days and come back, and it's like dramatic. Stuff happens, and then by the end of it, the whole thing is falling apart. So there's this sort of process that's happening despite yourself. I don't know. I love that sort of thing. The other one I skipped was a similar idea, just iterated differently. These were hanging spheres from the ceiling, and they're sitting on top of little mounds of pigment. Underneath them is a layer of salt, basically. And this was probably maybe a couple of weeks in or so. So there's some change happening. By the end of it, there was like pigment everywhere. Things were unfolding slowly. So anyway, how much more time I have left? There's not a ton left, but I can sort of go through these really quickly. This is another installation that I did, again, playing with pigment and magnets. I got into magnets for a while. And I did tests for these. So this is actually this thing that came up much later. So I'm not going to show you the other smaller tests I did, but these are, I think, 4 feet by 4 feet each, these platforms. So I had to build them specifically because I needed to create a mechanism underneath them that had a slow moving motor, which you can't see, obviously. But essentially what it is, it's a slow motor with an arm that's rotating a very strong magnet. And above it, the black stuff, those rings are magnetic pigment. And essentially, looks kind of like that initially, and over time it changes quite dramatically. And there's there are needles that are being dragged through the pigment. So there's again an example of something that is seemingly pretty straightforward. I mean, it's just this thing that is going around and around and around in a circle. But the change is quite dramatic from like, this is the very first, when I first turned it on, actually, the circle hadn't been fully completed at that point. And then by the end of it, you get these very wide circles, which is basically the effect of like the pigment slowly shifting over the magnet, and then maybe air currents in the space, moving things around a little bit. So the change is not perceptible if you stood there and watched it for 5 minutes, let's say, or even 10 minutes or an hour. But if you went away and came back 2 days later or something, I just love this idea of like, this thing is continuing to unfold with or without you. And you just encounter it. You encounter it today, you encounter it 10 days later. You never see it again. You know, it's doing its thing, independent of sort of my wants and needs. Yes.
Steve, a quick question. Is the surface paper here?
No, this is masonite with paint on it, with like a white paint, essentially.
I see. And the pigment is magnetic. Did you magnetize it, or can you obtain?
You can obtain it, yeah. So there again, I'm always like, I have this idea in my head. I'm like, there must be material for this. So I have to go make it. Usually I do. Or does it exist? Sometimes it does. In this case, it did exist. This is called CMR paint, which is basically what they use in toners, like large printers. You can buy it in bulk. You can buy it in bottles. It comes usually. But it's essentially black toner for one of them, laser or inkjet. I can't remember which one.
Laser, probably.
Yeah, and it's essentially you fill the toner, like if you want to refill your toners, you fill it with this powder. It gets everywhere. It's super, super fine. Almost like ash consistency. It's beautiful to work with, but it's magnetic. It happens to be magnetic for whatever reason they need it to be magnetic.
Steve, I'm always struck by this is meant to be a compliment, but how small I feel while witnessing kind of the process and how things turn out with your work. Because again, it's like how maybe it's more of an American idea of how we put our self-importance on ourselves, and you know, we're the protagonist in our own adventure. And here is your art saying, you know, with or without you, it will be created. You know, this is an event that's already happened, and you are just there. You'll witness it maybe, but you're insignificant, and it's kind of.
Yeah, that's very important to me. That's the process I went through when I was talking about in Paris after my doctorate. That is the transformation I went through. I went from making things to not wanting to make things because I felt like I was just getting in the way, you know. And I found it a lot more exciting to set things up and let them unfold. Whether it's like the myths of creation, like every time I make one of those, it's a surprise to me. I have no idea what's going to happen. And oftentimes on the video, you'll hear me like giggle or gasp or something because I don't know what's going to come out on that surface, you know.
But
Same thing here.
You're setting them up in a way like it kind of feels almost godly that you're setting things up and you're watching it unfold. Like God's, you know, we'll just say God in this weird way, but like creating man and letting it unfold, just kind of watching what happens, and that kind of has that feel to it.
Well, yes, in a way, but it's important. What I guess what I'm trying to say is I am in this context, I'm the same as you, you the viewer, in that I am also experiencing it for the first time. Like I have a sense of what might happen, but I have no idea. Like there's no way on the image on the screen now, there was no way for me to predict that these circles will end up being this wide and this dark in color. You could sort of maybe intuitively say, okay, I guess that's going to happen. But I have no idea. And in multiple tests I've done it, it didn't do that. So there's always a surprise for me as well. And I like that surprise. I like being a participant in the viewing of it, not just the making of it, if that makes sense. When you encounter it, when you, as a viewer, encounter this, you're like, what is going on here? On some level, I'm in the same position, like, what is going on here? I don't know what's going on. So I like that. I like being on the side of the viewer as well, not just the God creator. Or whatever.
Well, yeah, it's like when as painters we always say, "Oh, it's a happy accident," you know, when with the paint does something it's unexpected, and you've basically said, "I'm going to get rid of everything else and only deal with the happy
Yeah,
accidents
I'm
because
addicted to happy accidents. Thank you,
that's the
God.
best part anyway." So let's just eliminate
Yeah,
the other
yeah.
stuff.
Yeah, I think so. I find it most exciting. I find the happy accidents most exciting, and I think I came to the realization. I mean, I skimmed over the 2-year process after Paris when I went back, and it was a lot of discipline. I started composing, and I would find myself making things, and I would be like, why am I doing that? Why am I making these decisions here? Can I get rid of my making? What is it that I need to remove? As to your point, like I was constantly removing, and what was I left with? Essentially, was the essence of the work, with my needs and wants removed from it. And that was when I was like, this is how I want to work. I don't want to work in any other way. And I find it very weird now if I find myself having to make something or start to like fiddle with something in a very sort of direct way, I find it gross in a way, or objectionable. Not that there's anything wrong with that for anyone who does work that way. It just doesn't excite me as an artist to make that. That's all. I'm not sure what else is on here. I think that's it. Maybe no, I left some blanks. Yeah, these are the sound sculptures. I'll just go through these really quickly. These were sound sculptures that came up. I did the residency in Barcelona, I think, in 21. And it was, speaking of happy accidents, I shipped a bunch of things intending to work on them, and the box I shipped stuff in sat in the Madrid airport for the next 6 months. I think I got it back like 5 months after I came back from the residency or something. Anyway, it forced me to work in completely unexpected and different ways. And even after I left the residency, I wasn't entirely sure what I was going to do with these things that I created and how I would approach them. These ended up being sound sculptures, which is kind of a weird thing to show on a still. They're kinetic sound sculptures, so they almost all of them make sound, but also collect sound or filter sound in the space. So I became interested in this sort of lots of themes here. I don't necessarily need to get into all of them. There's sort of quasi-environmental things. They look like creatures. They're basically the sculpture itself, the little space, the white box almost looks like a house in a way. And what you're looking at is this thing that is, again, independent of us. And a lot of these are like 8 feet or 12 feet or 14 feet high. So they're impossible. Like go to the previous photo. You know, this is a normal human person. That's, I think, 14 feet up in the air. So there's no way to get to it. There's no way to see inside it. But what is inside is a little microphone. And what it's doing is it's listening to all the sounds in the space and conveying it to you via the headphones. So it's as if you were to place yourself inside it. You're getting this sort of, in sound design, it's called a point of audition. So you're hearing as if you were inside the thing that you cannot see or reach or get to. Yeah, this one on a tripod looks like a creature is, I think, 8 or 10 feet up in the air. I also did it with these small vessels. So again, they're being used as acoustic filters of the outside space. So the microphone is inside and you're hearing, there's no way to get your head in there or get your ear in there. So this is a way of sort of placing you inside the object. And they're, you know, fairly mundane objects, fairly sort of everyday objects. And then the last thing, I think, maybe the last thing, I don't know, is this installation. This was my most favorite installation to make. This was called A Vast Expanse, and it happened at MoCA Arlington last year, 2023. Part of the solos, 23, 24 solos. And I proposed the site-specific installation in their theater, in their small gallery. And I turned it into basically, again, playing with space. I wanted to place the viewer inside an impossible, like the most impossible space, which is the inside of a black hole. we theorize what might happen to you if you go through a black hole, but who the hell knows? So I wanted to place us at the edge of a black hole. And so essentially what you're looking at is a space that is utterly dark, except for a thin line of very bright light going sort of eye level, a little lower than eye level. And it takes a while for your eyes to adjust. You sort of lose completely when you walk in your sense of depth, your sense of perception. You don't know where the floor is necessarily. It's a bit tricky to be in there. There's nothing in the space other than floor, walls, and this light. And sound, there's a sound component to it, which again, you can't hear here, but I have it on my website. And you're immersed in the sound that is, so I wrote the software that basically created a generative sound, so it never repeats the same. It was also accepting some input from the space, so if it was crowded, it got a little bit more active. But you're in this sort of completely immersive sonic and visual environment that is alien and alienating, and you feel a little bit bewildered by it. And that's sort of the sensation that I wanted to capture in this. But simultaneously, it ended up being sort of cocoon-like. So it became kind of like a space you wanted to be in for a while. It's kind of restful after a while. There's another photo. These are wide lens photos. The space was a bit smaller than what I would have liked. But anyway, I'm not going to go into the magnet sculptures because even though they're fun, they're kind of whimsical. There's a series of magnet sculptures that I make. Just go through them really quickly. They're very different from everything else I make. These are actually me making things. But they all hinge on the idea of a magnet being embedded somewhere and things pointing to it. And the fascination I have is with this sort of gap in between the magnet and the object that it's holding. And then the last thing I'll talk about very, very briefly is what I'm doing next, since Jordan asked about that earlier. I'm exploring this new thing with ink on paper and paper sculpting with paper pulp, which I don't know anything about. It's quite fascinating. So I'm making these things. Again, I don't want to make things, but I am becoming more open to bringing my body back into the piece a little bit more, like using gestures and things like that to at least be part of the process. I'm not making a piece, but I'm contributing some sort of a bodily gesture to the piece, but then there's also other things that are outside my control and subject to the temperament of the material in a sense. So I'm making these what start out as Enzo discs. You all know what that is. That's the sort of the Zen circle, the half complete circle, that I then do various processes to, and it goes completely wild after a while. So these are ink on paper. Basically watercolor on paper, more or less, except these are all sort of start life out as completely black. And using water to sort of move things around a little bit. These are paper sculptures that are made with, in this case, a brick and some pulp that I made, and playing around with the pigmentation. These are natural pigments. And this is
Can you talk a little bit about, like, if you were doing something with pulp, for instance, like, do you seek out other artists who work in this medium and kind of pick their brains, or
a little bit
like a deep dive in the internet, or how does your process?
I do a deep dive. I just go and watch a ton of videos and do a lot of reading, and just watch people doing things. And occasionally I'll talk to people. I'm not great at talking to people or seeking people out, but sometimes it's good to sort of ask what people have done. But I do like this process of like banging my head against something and it's feeling impossible initially and feeling like an unsurmountable task. I like that aspect of it. I don't want to be told what to do. I want to sort of struggle. Not that like it's a fetishization of struggle, but there is something to be learned. And if someone tells you like, oh, don't do this, do this, they've already blocked off a lot of potential happy accidents. Let's say that, But whereas if you're doing something and like, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm not supposed to mix this pulp with this liquid or whatever, and you could completely destroy it, but you could also discover something that maybe wasn't there before, or you hadn't thought about, or maybe someone else discarded as an undesirable result, but you like, so I like doing it on my own and going through this process of fumbling around, like I'm sort of, you know, in a dark room, just kind of feeling my way through and seeing what comes out. Yeah. So anyway, that's the end of my presentation. Sorry, there was a lot of stuff. I'm happy to answer any questions, or just if you guys want to talk, that's fine too.
Yeah, that was fabulous, Steve. That was great. I kind of asked most of my questions during the talk, but I do love the way that you kind of move from one idea to another, kind of one, you know, just I do feel like your thought processes are all connected, though. You know, it doesn't feel like you said early on that they may feel very separate, but they do kind of talk to each other, and I can see a through line with all your work. It's really fascinating stuff, and I love it. Hopefully we have some questions from our participants. I'm sure they're out there.
What's that pink thing behind you? I love it. What the fuck is it?
It's a cast wax piece.
Very nice. I like that.
Yeah, I showed it earlier, I think, in the it's supposed to be lit, but it's unplugged right now. Yeah.
I missed the beginning. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, no worries. No worries.
Don't worry. Now at least I have time to see it and reference it later in one of my works. Okay, thank you.
Tim, what do you think about Steve's work? You've been around it quite a bit. Do you have any kind of insight onto, you know, why Steve is the incredible brain and mind behind all these incredible pieces? It's interesting to hear from one artist to another.
I give all the credit to his wife, but other than that, he's done what a lot of artists haven't managed to. Most artists spend most of their time mastering a medium and trying to do it. In other words, it comes in the form of an object, a painting, a thing, right? But he's been more interested in sound and movement and time and process. So because of that, he is this much more interesting kind of artist, especially for some of the room installations that I went to that dark room, and it's a lot creepier and cooler than he showed it there. So I say he's kind of an artist in a lot of ways. Right. How he's gonna make a living, God fucking knows. However, his art is always fascinating to go see.
We should have had you start with this whole off. That sounds like the perfect intro. We'll just move that to the beginning of the talk.
Right.
I have a question. If many of your artworks are processed. Now the music, I could see someone actually, you could install it somewhere else, or someone could buy it. But one of those art exhibits where it's taking time, like the black circles, what happens to those pieces? Does anyone buy them? How do you make a living?
Not by selling those black circles, that's for sure. Yeah, there's more to art, and my short answer is there's more to art for me than making it make a living for me. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But it doesn't stop me from sort of this childlike pursuit of the things that I find interesting. And I understand sort of the necessity for someone who is making a living out of their art, that they are restricted in some ways and don't have the privilege that I have of exploring these other possibilities that don't yield anything but the joy of themselves. And
I would also say that he's discovered this interesting thing, that if you're doing something that's odd process kind of thing, you have to encapsulate it for people if they want to actually purchase this thing. And when you put things in a round frame, you are acting as a portal into his mind. If you put it in a square frame, they're going to treat it like a painting and ignore it in a way. But with this circular thing, it gives him a view into his mind. And I think that has helped him greatly in a lot of his sales. Because I've seen him down at Art Miami and all the different fairs, and he does fine in those fairs.
Some things, like Tim is saying, some things do sell, but some things I don't expect them to sell, especially if they're ephemeral and time-based sort of installations. Then the thing is usually just discarded after. I'm looking for ways to find ways of creating something that can be, you know, a holdover after the installation is finished. But that's kind of a tricky thing to do. Yeah.
I'm fascinated by the whole presentation, but also how your brain works. I mean, you're an artist in the quest of learning. Like that's your artistry is learning and manipulating new things, and
Yeah.
you're just in a constant quest, and you're a process in itself as an artist.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. Yeah.
I admire that.
Thanks. Yeah, and again, it is a luxury and a privilege in some ways to be able to do that, but I'm also kind of a pretty stubborn person, so I've refused to I refuse to give in. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a common thread, especially now that since we have a Washington Glass School a guy here too, the common thread of like how the untrained actually benefits the craft. And I've heard them tell me multiple times, like, you know, who needs an MFA kind of thing. And you have the higher education in sound, of course, but you know, at that exploration of mediums, I think definitely, you know, I asked the question earlier, would you want that background in training of visual arts? And I think the exploration is your art, you know, and I think if you had the training, it wouldn't nearly be as exciting to you and the viewer. I think that comes through in your work, that when we see the art, we share in your like you said, share in your discovery, and I think that's the kind of the joy of it. So love it, man.
Thanks. Thank you.
Just wonderful. I wish we had the interaction of or video. And I'll go again to your website, but and I tell everybody to do so, because I think now that we've heard this, it's going to have a different meaning to see the videos, even though they're a poor representation of the entire experience you created.
Yeah, they're meant to be experiential installations, but you know, you can only get so close. Yeah.
My first time I ran into Steve, he wasn't even there. But at Artomatic one year, he had these balloons that he did
the
ball.
I
And
showed those.
I went there with Michael O'Sullivan, and we were doing the tour in the middle of the week, and we stood in front of his thing for half an hour and said, "What kind of loon is he? I got to meet this guy." And then, how did I know he would marry a friend of mine? But that helped. That helped.
What kind of space do you work in?
Good question.
You mean my studio or?
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm right now at home. This is sort of a makeshift home studio. And I was actually helping people mix some songs. So I have my audio set up behind me, but the space I have, it's always smaller than I like it to be, even though it's big. I have a studio that's in an industrial sort of area, and it's what's called a dirty studio. So there are welders and glass blowers and other things, ceramicists in there, and it can be a little dusty and stuff, but which is hard, a bit tricky when I'm casting clear resin. But you know, I find ways. But that's the kind of space I like. It's sort of this industrial. My studio looks like a mess because not quite literally a mess, but I have all the materials in the world in there, so it's kind of hard to keep it organized. I've got electronics, I've got paints, I've got liquid paints, I've got fabric, I've got, you know, I don't know, plaster and cement, and yeah, it's like a lab. So it's a bit difficult to keep it organized, and I've sort of given up on like the need to have it look a certain way, and I just know where things are, and depending on what project I'm working with or what series I'm working with, I'll just do that for a while and then go out, you know, go to the next thing.
He's going to help us with the project for the White House.
Oh yeah, I need to contact Mike about that. Yeah,
An impossible one, but we're gonna try.
It is a bit impossible. Yes,
I want to ask you, do you meditate?
I do. Yeah, I do.
I would imagine you do, to get into your, you know.
Not as often as I'd like to, but yeah. When I got into meditation, I got through it into it through sort of the side door. I had written a paper for publication, and I was sort of grappling with a lot of ideas about perception at the time and phenomenology, and one of the reviewers recommended some books, and years later, and I was looking at the person's recommendations, I got back into those books and discovered that a lot of there are cognitive scientists that wrote it, and a lot of them were meditators. Like, oh, I should try this meditation thing. I'd been doing yoga for years before that, so yeah.
Final call before we let Steve get back to work.
Well, I think I've heard the saying that artists teach us to see. You teach us to hear and experience more than just seeing. So I really like that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks again, Steve. It was a incredible talk. Yeah, I enjoyed hearing a very different kind of approach to making and experiencing work. So it was a real treat for us. Welcome back in 2 weeks. We visit another artist.
We have Aishwarya Chandrasekhar, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing correctly. I will correct myself when I have a session with her this afternoon. But she will be, she's of Indian ancestry and but is American born and raised. Her mom is also an artist, and she uses dots and pen and ink and geometric approaches to express her perception of human behavior and social networks. So not completely divorced from what you said a little bit, Steve. So we'll welcome her next week. And she's trained in neurobiology, psychology, and also social anthropology. And she's also trained in kolam, which is an Indian custom of painting in front of your house, some geometric pattern that then gets swept away and you start again the next day. So talking about time, it's so cool. Anyway.
Yeah, and don't forget to visit Steve's webpage so you can actually hear some of these incredible images that we witnessed today. But other than that, we'll see you in
Wait. I want to congratulate Jordan on his prize for his painting. He won second place in the Bethesda painting prize, and he should have won first. So I'm really happy for him.
Thanks. I appreciate that, Tim. Thanks for everyone who showed up last night. It was really fun. It did feel, I'm going to be a little embarrassed by this. It did feel more like my reception than a group show. I'm grateful for all the supporters, students, and everybody who showed up last night. It was pretty exciting. And thanks for the vote of confidence, Tim.
Well, thank you guys. Thank you everyone for showing up, and thank you for inviting me, and glad to have talked to you all.
That was great. Thank you.
Bye, Steve.
And the video should be edited and up by Monday, maybe even by Sunday.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.